Okay. So hi, I'm Mary, and I am an associate lecturer at the School of Geography and Sustainable Development in St. Andrews University. I usually now mainly teaching, and I have two modules, one about statistical methods for social scientists and one about environment and health for honor students. But also I do some research, and today I'm going to talk about research from the Migrant Life Project, which I worked for as a postdoc before starting my associate lecturer position. So the Migrant Life Project is a project which aims to assess the integration of immigrants across European countries, and it's led mainly by Professor Hilkulu. And then also we have a project collaborator from Sweden, Professor Gunnar Andersson from Stockholm University. And I put here some pictures of the team members for the Migrant Life Project. So we have postdocs, and those include Dr. Sarah Christensen, Andrew Ibbotson, Joseph Harrison, and myself. We have also Dr. Andreas Hun and Dr. Julia Mikolai, and then Dr. Chia Lu, and we had past members which include, but now they left the project, Dr. Izor Delaporte and Dr. Shupankar Sharma. And we have our PhD student also in the project, Parth Pandya, and we have Dr. Julie Lacroix. So this is, in a nutshell, the team of the Migrant Life Project. Now, just before I start my own presentation, I usually work within the Migrant Life Project on Sweden. This is the country which I work on. But in the project, we try also to do comparative studies whereby we compare several European countries. And I just wanted to show you here a snapshot of one comparative study that we've done before I dive into Sweden. So we tried to assess the residential mobility and housing tenure changes among immigrants and their descendants across 5 European countries. And several people from the Migrant Life Project were involved in this study. So those are the 5 countries which were involved, which we tried to compare the residential mobilities across immigrants between those 5 European countries. So we had Sweden, which I worked on the analysis, and then we have the UK, we have Germany, we have Switzerland, and we have France. So these are summary of the main findings that we've found about residential mobility patterns across the 5 European countries and across the immigrant generations and country groups of origin. So if we take, for example, UK, which is here in the orange, we can see that mostly first generation Indians have a high residential mobility compared to the UK natives, and also the same for first-generation immigrants from Bangladesh. So first-generation immigrants are adult immigrants who came to the country. If we go to the second generation, so second generation are people who are born in the country, but their parents come from another countries. They are immigrants. And if we look at the second generation, we see more assimilation in the residential mobility patterns to that of the UK natives. So now residential mobility is either equal, for example, more or less equal to the UK among second generation Europeans and Western Europe, and it's less, for example, for the other second generation immigrant groups. So this is the case of UK. If we look at France, on the other hand, and we compare it to the UK natives, we see that almost all first generation immigrants in France, compared to the UK natives, they have also higher residential mobility. Whereas for second generation, they have a little bit lower, and this stands for second generation from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. However, we don't see so much difference between second generation and first generation immigrants in the France case. If we go to Germany now, we see for first generations and second generations, all of them have lower residential mobility than UK natives. In Switzerland, almost everyone have higher residential mobility risk or odds ratios than the UK natives. and for Sweden as well. So we can see here, like in a comparative approach, how residential mobility differs between the 5 countries. So this is what we try to do in the Migrant Life Project. However, today I'm going to focus more about Sweden because this is the country which I do my analysis on. And the slides are not moving. 1 second. Okay. So in Sweden, I performed analysis about home ownership, and I assessed home ownership across immigrant groups and generations in Sweden. And I tried to see whether there is an assimilation or segmentation story. And in this analysis, it was me mainly doing the analysis, but also I was supervised by Gunnar Andersen and Hilkulu. So just an introduction to the topic of home ownership. Home ownership presents wealth, higher quality of life, and it's also an important indicator of immigrant integration in the host society. So in this study, we used large administrative longitudinal data from Sweden on the whole population of Sweden to assess the association between moving to first-time home ownership and immigrant groups and generations. So in this study, we differentiated between generations of immigrants as follows. So we had like first generation or 1G, and those are immigrants who come to Sweden at age of 18 plus. And then we had also immigrants who come to Sweden at ages of below 18, and we refer to those as the 1.5 generation or 1.5G. We also distinguished between people born in Sweden with depending on their parents' country group of origin. So we separated descendants of immigrants as follows. We had like 2G or the second generation, and those are people who are born in Sweden, but they have 2 foreign-born parents. And then we had also the 2.5G, and those are people who are born in Sweden, but they have only 1 foreign-born parent. And then we had also the native Swedes, and those are people who are born in Sweden, and they have 2 Swedish-born parents. And then also we further classified the immigrants and their descendants based on the countries of origin. And we had 2 outcomes in this study. The first outcome was moving into first-time home ownership in terms of apartments and single-family home ownership. And also we investigated just moving into single-family home ownership. And we focus only on the first-time moves. So just to give some theoretical background about housing and immigration, the housing and moving to home ownership and also immigration is affected by cultural, social, political, institutional, and financial factors. So for cultural factors, this includes housing preferences, for example, attachment to host country versus the country of origin. So if, like, for example, immigrants, they have still strong ties to their countries of origin, they might not invest in home ownership in the country, in the destination country, but rather invest in their countries of origin. We also have social factors, and those include, for example, discrimination, ethnic segregation, and place stratification versus spatial assimilation and integration. We have also financial factors. Of course, this is really important. In order to own a house, the person needs resources and certain type of wealth to invest in home ownership. And also we have political institutional factors, and those include all the policies related to housing and the housing market in Sweden. So we developed 3 hypotheses for this study. And the first one included it mentions that we expect to see slower entry into first-time homeownership among first-generation immigrants from low and middle-income countries compared to native Swedes. The second hypothesis is that we expect to see similar or faster entry to first-time homeownership among first-generation immigrants from high-income countries compared to native Swedes. And the third hypothesis is that we expect to see closer rates of entry to first-time homeownership to that of native Swedes among the 1.5G, 2G, and 2.5G compared to the 1G immigrants especially for individuals who have origins from high-income countries. And this is in line with gradual assimilation of immigrants in the homeownership domain. So for methods, we used, as I mentioned before, individual level registry data from Statistics Sweden, and this covers the whole population of Sweden. We also included all individuals born in Sweden and the 1.5 generation who became 18 between 1997 and 2016. We also included all individuals born in Sweden and the 1.5 generation immigrants who are still living with their parents in 1997 and aged more than 18. And we included all immigrants who arrived in Sweden, first generation immigrants between 1997 and 2016. For analysis, we used Cox proportional hazards models with age since 18 as baseline for our analysis. This is just here an axis diagram which illustrates the structure of the data set. So typically we follow individuals. For everyone born in Sweden, we follow them since age 18, or if they are still living with the parents in 1997, also we include them no matter at whatever age they enter. And also we include in the study first generation immigrants whenever they come into Sweden. And then we follow all of these individuals until censoring. And censoring could be due to death or to migrating out of Sweden, or if they reach age 50 because we didn't want to include retiring home ownership. And also if they transition into the event of interest, which is the first time home ownership. And we included people like our study involved the years of 1997 to end of 2016. And this is because home ownership data existed only for that period in the Swedish data. So now I will go to the results. So in the first graph here, I'm showing Kaplan-Meier estimates for entry to first-time apartments and single-family home ownership for more than 3 million individuals in Sweden. And we can see here that compared to the native Swedes who are presented here in the black line, compared to them, we see that people from Nordic/Western Europe/North America, 2.5 generation, they exhibit the closest rates of entry into home ownership compared to the native Swedes. And they are followed by Nordic, Western Europe, and North America 1.5G and 2nd G groups. Whereas we can see for those who come from the rest of the world, they don't show that close patterns of transition to first-time apartments and single-family home ownership like the native Swedes. They are a bit deviated. They are a bit slower in going to home ownership. However, the fastest rate, we see that among the 2.5 generation here, which is the red straight line, and then followed by the rest of world 1.5G and 2nd generation groups. If we go to the first generation, on the other hand, we see that many of them actually go to first-time apartment and single-family home ownership in their first year in Sweden, so upon arrival. And we suspect that this could be due to the fact that in Sweden, we don't have so much rental opportunities and there are long queues for rental opportunities. So people either like have to buy a house if they have the means for that, or they have to seek subletting options. Again, like when we plot the Kaplan-Meier estimates, but this time just for single-family home ownership, we see again like similar pattern, but the rate of going to single-family home ownership is slower than that for single-family apartments, for that of single-family home ownership plus apartments home ownership. And this is expected because usually single-family home ownership requires a lot of investment as well. We still see some first-generation immigrants, especially those from Nordic, Western Europe, and North America, first generation, they move to first time single family home ownership also in their first year in Sweden upon arrival. This graph here, it shows the hazard ratios of entry to first-time apartment and single-family home ownership by immigrant origin and generation in Sweden. And these models here are adjusted for sex, age at entry to study, marital status, parity, education, earnings, region of residence, year of entry into study, and also we included a dummy variable for first-generation immigrants in their first year in Sweden. And we can see here that first-generation immigrants from Western Europe and from Nordic countries and also from North America, they show higher hazard ratios of entry into first-time apartment and single-family home ownership compared to the native Swedes. Also, we see that for Southeast Asia first generations, but this is due to marriage because like most of these immigrants come for marriage and their spouses already own a house in Sweden. Whereas we see for other first-generation immigrants groups, they show lower hazard ratios than the native Swedes, and the lowest hazard ratio is for sub-Saharan first-generation immigrants. If we go toward the 1.5 generation groups and the second generation groups, we can see that they are still deviating from the native Swedes with respect to transitioning to first-time apartment and single-family home ownership, but we can see they are becoming more closer to the native Swedes, more closer toward the dashed line. And we still notice that the lowest hazards of going to home ownership is among the sub-Saharan African group, whether among the 1.5 generation or also the second generation. And finally, for the 2.5 generation, we see that they are becoming even closer to the native Swedes in their hazard ratios, but still they are a bit different. And the lowest hazard ratios, again, they are for sub-Saharan African 2.5 generation. We repeated the same analysis, but this time just focusing on transitioning to single-family home ownership. And we see also similar patterns. So still, first-generation immigrants from Nordic and Western Europe and North America, they show higher hazard ratios of moving to single-family home ownership than the native Swedes. And the lowest hazard ratios are for first-generation sub-Saharan African group. And for the 1.5G and second generation groups, they are still deviating from the native Swedes, whereas the 2.5 generation groups, they show more the closest patterns to that of native Swedes. Finally, we tried to do logistic regression to see the association between going to first-time apartments and single-family home ownership and the different groups of only first-generation immigrants in their first year of immigration in Sweden, because based on the Kaplan-Meier estimates, we saw that many of those immigrants, they go into home ownership directly upon arrival in their first year in Sweden. And here the reference group is Nordic's first generation group. And we can see that compared to Nordic, Western Europe first generation and North America first generation, they show the closest hazard ratios of going to first-time apartments and single-family home ownership to that of Nordic and also the Southeast Asian first generation, whereas we see the lowest hazard ratios of going to first-time apartments and single-family home ownership in the first year is among Indian first-generation groups and sub-Saharan African first-generation groups. Again, the same analysis, but this time just focusing on the single-family home ownership. We see, again, similar patterns. So Western European first generation and also North America, they have higher hazard ratios of going to first-time single-family home ownership compared to Nordics. And the lowest hazard ratios are observed for Indian first generation and sub-Saharan African first generation. So finally, just a conclusion and some take-home messages. Using large-scale register data from Sweden, this study showed a gradual housing assimilation across migrant generations. However, we still see that the home ownership levels are still varying across migrant groups, which supports segmentation, and this could be attributed to sociocultural and economic heterogeneities across the countries of origin. So thank you so much for listening for me today. And the Migrant Life Project was funded by the European Research Council under the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation program. And those are my details if you want to contact me after the presentation or if you have any questions. And I'm looking forward for the questions.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was lots of fascinating stuff to try and take in there. We've got some time left for questions. Does anyone want to ask Mary any questions about her research?
Hi. Sorry, just to jump in. Thank you so much, Mary, for that presentation. It was really interesting and yeah, lots to take away from it. One of the questions I had was around the differentiation around apartment, and I think it was first time home ownership, family home ownership. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the types of residents that you looked into in the research and if there were sort of differences in terms of that for different groups.
Yeah, so like the two outcomes they focus rather than the type of the accommodation on the tenure of the accommodation. So in Sweden usually we had like you have like several types of tenure. So everything that is not rental we classified it under ownership. So single family home ownership is just like owning a single house, whereas the apartments one, they call it also tenant shared home ownership. So it's like a big dwelling which has several apartments, and then they like the people living in that dwelling, they share the home ownership for the apartments in that dwelling. So this is what we classified as apartments home ownership. And then when we try to do the analysis, we can see like similar patterns among the immigrants between like the two types of tenure. However, the reason also why we only included analysis just focusing on single family home ownership is that because we had a really large number of first generation immigrants going to home ownership in their first years. And then we thought that that would be mainly going to apartments and subletting is mostly done at the apartments level rather than the single family home ownership. And also, as like the Kaplan-Meier curve showed, like it's much less amount of first generation immigrants going directly to single family home ownership in their first year of Sweden. So that's why we included two types of analysis.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to ask Mary anything? Can I just ask Mary, so you mentioned the other countries at the start. Was Sweden similar to the other countries, or was it exceptional in some ways in terms of their patterns of home ownership?
Yeah, so the Nordic countries actually they show the most similar patterns in terms of home ownership to Sweden, to native Swedes. They are a bit different, but like for example, like Nordics are more likely to go to home ownership, to transition to first-time home ownership among the first generation immigrants compared to the native Swedes, whereas like that second generation and the 1.5 generation and the 2.5 generation are a little bit less likely than the native Swedes, but they are the closest, yeah, in terms of home ownership patterns to native Swedes. I guess also because they are neighboring countries and they really like, there's like frequent commuting between the countries, and they have also the freedom of movement and work. So all of this helps in a more ease access to home ownership.
You know, I was asking Mary about So
Yeah.
in Switzerland and Germany and the UK, in Sweden, were the migrants becoming assimilated to the kind of the general trend more quickly or more slowly than in other countries that you were looking at in the wider project?
Okay, so you mean, yeah, in the comparative, sorry,
Yeah.
in that
It's all
slide.
right.
Yeah, I can show again the slide. Let me just 1 second. So this one here,
Mm-hmm.
let me just enlarge it. Yeah, so those are like the Swedes here.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we can see like because here they are comparing them in the comparative project just to UK natives. So this is like the comparison point here. So you can see that everyone among the native Swedes, not native Swedes, like among the Swedish immigrants to Sweden, all groups except like those two groups which are first generation Poland and second generation Turkish. They have like the lowest rates of residential mobility, and they are closer to the UK natives, whereas all the other groups have higher patterns of higher hazard ratios or odds ratios of residential mobility compared to UK natives. But if we take, for example, the native Swedes here, which is this bar here, so we can see the most similar groups to it in terms of residential mobility are first generation Indians and North Africans. They are a bit higher. They have a bit higher residential mobility than the native Swedes. And then if we go to the lowest, we see that the lowest is among Polish and second generation Middle East immigrants and also second generation Turkish. Those they show like the lowest rates of residential mobility compared to the native Swedes.
And of course, in Sweden, you've got the wonderful register data. Can you say a little bit about where the data comes from for the other countries? Is it as robust?
Yeah, so for Sweden, we have like the whole population. It's
Yeah.
registered data. I guess the same as for also Switzerland. So Switzerland is also registered data. So that's why like we can see like Switzerland and Sweden are more or less like more comparative to each other than the other countries. For UK, it's from the Understanding Society data. So it's
Yeah.
survey data. It's not registered data. For France, it comes from TIO. So this is also, they also rely on administrative data, but they've created a sample from the administrative data. And it's also included survey data. So it's a mixture. I guess Germany is also survey data. Germany is survey data. It's not administrative data. It's similar to the UK, Germany.
Mhm.
So like but like even if like the data does not come from registries but come like from surveys such as UK and Germany, they are like based on large representative survey data. So for example, the Understanding Society data in the UK represents the population in the UK, so it's a large longitudinal study and it's representative. So I would say like the results are robust, but of course, like that might be an issue that maybe we have to look into for the countries that use registered data versus the countries that use survey data, for example.
Thanks, Mary. I've got lots more questions, but
Okay.
I'll not hog all the questions. Does anyone else on the call want to ask Mary a question?
Sorry, could I ask another? Is that
Yeah, please
okay?
do. Please do.
Something that I was quite interested in as you were talking, so you said, the project split across the different countries, um, and you looked particularly at Sweden. Was the is the data linked to certain geographies? Is something I don't know in terms of next steps, but is sort of geographical differences in within Sweden something that you would be able to see or be interested in looking at?
Yeah, so I've sorry, I've got suggestions, for example, to do like some spatial analysis or like see the patterns, how they differ, for example, by counties within Sweden or states within Sweden. So that could be, yeah, a brilliant idea for future steps in the project to see like within country differences, for example, with respect to residential mobility or even like with respect to home ownership rates. I've tried like to do just a sensitivity analysis on Stockholm region, just to see how patterns differ for Stockholm region as a sensitivity analysis, but it wasn't like the main analysis yet. So yeah, that would be interesting for future steps.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Oren, go for it, please.
Great, thanks, Mary. So glad I wasn't supposed to be here today, but my week freed up now, so I'm so happy I made it to this. It was a really interesting talk. Sort of my question is just thinking about, that conclusion about the sort of national variation in sort of each of the sort of five spaces that the wider study looks at, and thinking about maybe the sort of wider variation from each sort of home place as it was. And I was just thinking about maybe like ownership strategies and I guess how knowledgeable particularly like first gen migrants are about maybe some of the strategies that might help people enter ownership earlier, because I presume that might be what you were alluding to when you were talking about maybe like the different backgrounds and policies. And I wonder now that in some states, maybe like the UK, where home ownership is a little bit more precarious across the board. Do you think that this research has any sort of impact as to maybe how we can maybe reshape our policy to be a little bit maybe more transparent, particularly for first generation migrants that maybe aren't aware of what sort of strategies that we might need to enter home ownership at some point? That might be a really vague question, but I just thought it might be worth asking.
Yeah, thank you so much for making it also to the seminar and for the question. Yeah, this is really great suggestion because I guess yeah, like my results were showing, for example, that immigrants, first generation immigrants from Western Europe and from Nordic countries, they exhibit like the most similar patterns to native Swedes, and that could be maybe due to policies, like they are more knowledgeable, for example, about the procedures to go to home ownership or about policies, especially that they live like nearby Sweden, like and they are all within the European Union. So some types of policies and moving to home ownership, for example, like also like access to mortgage might be easier for them, or they might be more knowledgeable about these opportunities, which enable them to go faster to home ownership versus like immigrants who come from distant countries from other part of the world who might like not be aware about specific policies or ways to go to home ownership, and it might also be maybe really different in their countries, the ways like you go to home ownership compared like for example to Sweden. So yeah, that would be actually interesting, but I don't know like what type of quantitative data would give you information about this, because like I'm using register data. So I would suggest maybe for future like certain surveys, if they can ask some questions relating like to policies, like large representative surveys relating to policies regarding access to home ownership, or maybe even qualitative studies like through interviews or focus groups, would help us like gain more insight about this and then inform the policymakers in turn to like how like to make it more knowledgeable among like newly arriving immigrants in the countries. So yeah, but thank you so much for the suggestion. This is really a great one.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting stats there. Like it's really interesting. So just thought I would add that.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up, if that's all right. I guess yeah, the register data, you're right, Mary, wouldn't have that at all. But I guess maybe something like Understanding Society would have, in the UK context at least, some questions about people's preferences around, like, the extent to whether they want to move or able to move, or whether they like their neighborhoods and their housing situations. There might be some scope there for attitudinal stuff, maybe.
Yeah, maybe, you're right. Yeah, I guess, yeah, understanding society has some variables relating to neighborhoods, as you
Yeah,
said. So
yeah.
maybe like a case study, about like just for example, UK or like Germany, if they have some questions in their survey as well about the specific policies, that would be interesting. Yeah, case studies rather than like comparative study for all the countries. I'll communicate that to my colleague who is working on the UK data. Yeah.
Can I just ask me about, the slide near the start they had a minute ago about the residential mobility and how it varies? Do you have any thoughts on how we should interpret that in terms of basically it being a good or bad thing? If people are moving around a lot, is that basically because they're in a precarious situation? Or if they don't move around, is that because they're happy there, or they don't have the resources to move? Like, how do you think we should interpret that sort of data?
Yeah, so I guess like we did like further analysis about like I remember upper and lower movement, like the direction of the movement. But like I just here want to show like a snapshot of the analysis. But I guess you're right, like so usually for immigrants, like we saw in our analysis as well, and there is my colleague Chia also did just on Germany, like more analysis about like deeper analysis about like immigrants and refugees and the residential mobility. So usually like immigrants when they first arrive, yeah, they are moving a lot because they are not stable yet. Like they are still like integrating in the society, managing their way and maybe changing jobs and employment. So they move a lot. So also it's important to study like the residential mobility as well with respect to employment. And this is also what now like we are doing like in the next steps of the project, trying to see like how employment and marriage and childbirth affect also home ownership and residential mobility, because all of these events are connected and they lead to each other. So yeah, so it could be, yeah, moving too much is not good because you're not stable yet. But we saw that with time, immigrants usually they integrate eventually in the host society, and then they might find a place where they belong to and then just settle there. And then their patterns of residential mobility becomes more similar than to the native Swedes with time. But at the beginning, they are moving a lot. So this is like, yeah, the major conclusion.
Paula?
Yeah, hi, Mary. I was just wondering, obviously you're breaking up or you're kind of looking at the groups for immigrants is often by their kind of regional or national kind of context from which they've arrived. Have you looked at any other ways of kind of splitting up the kind of immigrant groups in regards to their socioeconomic status, etc., to look at where the differences might be, or do you think this comes from kind of understandings of those national contexts and strategies that they might have in their kind of countries of origin?
Yeah, so like here, if I want to break up things, let's say by socioeconomic status, I can only do this based on what they are working at the moment. Sorry, so what is captured by the Swedish register data, because like the Swedish register data does not have like information about their past life before, for example, especially for immigrants before arriving in Sweden. So we don't have like information about like their degree of wealth, like how much money they had, what they were working before arriving in Sweden, and so on and so forth. So if you want only like to break more by socioeconomic status, you can focus on the time from their arrival in Sweden onwards, and for example, use income quintiles or the type of employment, for example, and then yeah, try to create a variable whereby it breaks that down further by income and employment status. So yeah, that could be done as a further step. It's a nice idea as well. Thanks, Paula, for suggesting this. Yeah, but we cannot know anything before they come to Sweden. So anything related like to their past financial situation and what they brought with them to Sweden in terms of financial resources. We don't have access to that in the register data. Yeah, maybe survey data can help also here, or qualitative data as well.
Thanks, Mary. That's great.
Thank you.
So, Mary, would the registered data include like international students and refugees and asylum seekers and things as well?
Yeah, so yeah, the registered data, yeah, they have
Everyone?
so in my data I had like students, refugees, asylum seekers. So I can break also more by these categories. So that could be also more like sensitivity analysis or further steps as well. Yeah, to see like how different types of immigrants are affected with respect to their home ownership. But I adjust my models for the type of immigration, whether it's a refugee or asylum seeker or a student.
Okay, okay. Would anyone else like to ask any final questions? Well, in that case, then we'll just thank Mary for giving the talk this afternoon. So we'll get this posted on the website and things in due course. And yeah, thanks again so much for your time, Mary, and best of luck with the rest of your research.
Oh, thank you so much.